From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. This episode of Blue Sky features an extremely experienced and successful teacher, consultant, and leader in the world of nonprofits and international development organizations. Nathalie Laidler-Kylander is in charge of Trickle Up, an organization she joined as CEO in 2021. She brings to this position over 30 years of experience across sectors, including 18 years in the international development field. She's particularly passionate about the social and economic inclusion of women. Prior to Trickle Up, Nathalie was a managing director at the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. There, since 2015, she acted as an operating partner to early-stage nonprofits and social enterprises across the world, serving on their boards and helping them build capacity and achieve their maximum impact. An academic as well as a practitioner, she's also lectured on nonprofit management and leadership at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and the Kennedy School at Harvard. Nathalie is widely recognized as a leading expert on nonprofit brand management and spent a decade researching, teaching, and consulting with dozens of nonprofit organizations. Her work's been published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review and the Harvard Business Review. She's also the co-author of The Brand Idea, Managing Nonprofit Brands with Integrity, Democracy, and Affinity. Earlier in her career, Nathalie held positions with the United Nations Development Program in Senegal and Doctors Without Borders in Armenia, as well as management roles in the medical field. She holds a BS in biochemistry from Imperial College at London University, an MBA from Harvard Business School, and a PhD from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Nathalie enjoys skiing, sailing, and participating in triathlons. She lives in the Boston area and, according to her bio, has 4 children, 3 cats, 2 dogs, and 1 husband. I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky conversation with Nathalie Laidler-Kylander as much as I did. Nathalie Laidler-Kylander, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill.
It's a great pleasure. And I want to start by asking, you've been at Trickle Up since 2021. But before that, nearly 30 years of experience you had in the nonprofit space. You and I actually were classmates at Harvard Business School. Not everyone goes from an environment like that into nonprofit. So what is it that has drawn you to nonprofit work?
Yeah, thanks. So I guess growing up, I was privileged to live in a lot of different countries, but I saw a lot of deep inequality and unequal access to opportunities and to resources. And that always struck me as kind of wrong. And then growing up, some of my heroes were Save the Children or Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International. I was always really interested in what they were doing, and it felt so cool to me that they were doing these kinds of really great things, a little bit different to each of them, but they just seemed so cool to me. And my father was a diplomat, but my mother was very politically engaged, and so she was always writing letters on behalf of Amnesty and volunteering at homeless shelters. And so I think a lot of her passion for that kind of work rubbed off on me. I'd say also, while having a sense of kind of privilege, also coupled with a sense of responsibility, and sort of back to this unequal access to resources and opportunities. So I always felt like, okay, I've got this great life and others don't. So what can I do to kind of balance that? And then, I've done a lot of different work in a lot of different sectors, but the nonprofit sector is the hardest one to work in for a number of reasons. But,
right.
There's this great quote, I think it's by Roosevelt, that says, something like nothing in this world is worth doing or having unless it involves pain and difficulty. I'm not sure I 100% agree with the pain, but there is something about the joy of accomplishment that comes from doing something really hard. So I think that also draws me to this sector.
Fascinating. And you've mentioned your dad was a diplomat. Where are some of the places you lived, and for whom was he a diplomat?
Yeah. So he's a Brit.
Okay.
And I was born in Cambodia. So he was working, for the Brits in Cambodia. He was a British diplomat. And then he also, when the UK joined the European Union, became delegated to the European Union and spent a lot of his time in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the Pacific. And so I had the opportunity really to experience a lot of different cultures through that.
Fascinating. So you had all these various roles, you've lived in all these various places, and presumably 3-4 years ago, you hear about this opportunity at Trickle Up. What about Trickle Up attracted you to jump in as their CEO?
Yeah. So prior to Trickle Up, I was working at a foundation, and my job there was really to work with a lot of different early stage organizations. And I had the privilege of working with a lot of different organizations in a lot of different sectors. But what I realized over the 6 years I was working there, I was increasingly really drawn to organizations that focused or promoted women's economic empowerment. And the reason why that is so exciting to me is that when women have resources and agency or decision making over those resources, they really invest in three things. They invest in health, they invest in education, and they invest in nutrition. And so what they do is that they interrupt the cycle of intergenerational poverty by really leveraging the resources they have to bring to those three areas. And so I was always really impressed by that.
Yes.
Trickle Up's been around for a while, but the other thing that really drew me to Trickle Up is that their programmatic approach, it's really a solution, right? It's focused on the individual. It's focused on these sort of solidarity groups of women. It provides a solution to a complex problem. So I really liked the sustainability, the focus on women and women's economic empowerment, and the fact that it's a lasting solution. I'd say those three really, really drew me in.
The part about focusing on women is really interesting. And one of our recent interviews was with John Wood, who wrote Leaving Microsoft to Change the World. He started Room to Read. And then later, Yugo is his current passion. And Yugo is 100% focused on girls and women. And essentially, it's the generation that came through Room to Read who's now thinking about college. And he shared something very similar where he said the percentage of money, if you give a woman $1 in one of these countries or a man $1, the man spends it way more selfishly than the women who spend it on their kids, all the things you just described. So it's very consistent with his approach. That's interesting to hear you echo that.
Yeah, and other organizations like CARE and BRAC, many organizations that are really focused on addressing poverty and extreme poverty in the world, they really recognize the focus on women and investing in women creates an outsized impact. So I think that's pretty consistent with the experience of a lot of different organizations, actually.
And the name Trickle Up, I assume it's a flip on trickle down economics. Where do you know the history of the name, where that comes from, and what's the meaning of it to you?
Yeah. So Trickle Up was founded by Mildred and Glenn Leet in 1979, which was really at a time where Reagan-era economic theory espoused trickle-down economics, right? This notion or the idea that if you make the rich richer, that wealth trickles down and benefits everyone. So I think the name was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of reaction, but it's also really, I think, an alternative theory, right? That says by starting by benefiting the poorest segment of society, that actually benefits everybody else, right? So it's an alternative idea to the trickle down economics. But I also think it's a very powerful concept. I think a lot of development tends to be very large, bureaucratic, focused on big picture advocacy or changing government policy. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I do think, for the elites in particular, the idea of this very small, focused on the individual approach was an alternative or maybe a complementary approach to more traditional international development work.
At some level, we're all a product of our upbringing and the environment by which we've been surrounded. With a father who was a diplomat and a mother who was deeply involved with charitable organizations, it's not surprising to find Nathalie Laidler-Kylander now doing the work that she does. And I like her simple reasoning behind her motivation. She says, "I had this great life and others didn't." It's clear that at Trickle Up, Nathalie leads an organization that takes on ambitious objectives with a clear sense of focus. Their activities center on fostering women's economic empowerment, and they invest in 3 areas: health, education, and nutrition. By doing this with some of the poorest of the poor, they've seen the benefits trickle up to the full societies in which they work. Now, back to our conversation. On the subject of international development, I've heard this from people sometimes when you talk to someone about how you direct your philanthropy, how you spend your time trying to improve the world. Some look at international, if you're based in the United States, they look at international work sometimes as, well, that's all well and good, but we have so many problems here at home. Why are you spending all your time in India and Cambodia and these other places? Clearly, you've chosen to work more abroad. You're not by birth an American necessarily, but could you talk about that? What is it about? I think I know the answer, but I want to ask you because I know people think of it. Why focus abroad as opposed to right in your own backyard?
Yeah, I think it's great to focus on your own backyard. I think for me, I think some of my background of growing up internationally and across a lot of different geographies, I just feel a strong affinity, not just to the people where I live, but to the people globally. I really think of ourselves as being part of one human family. And I think, the other thing that I find really interesting is the return, if you will, is it can be, I don't want to generalize, but it can be really meaningful in a low resource setting. And so, there's kind of this argument perhaps that spending efforts and money in a low resource setting can actually provide a lot more social impact. So there is that argument, the sort of effective altruism argument that suggests that, what you spend in a sort of a local context gives you a certain amount of impact, but spending that same amount in a low resource setting actually provides, potentially a bigger impact. But I would not say one is more important than the other. I think both are necessary.
Yeah, I heard it described. The first time I heard it was with Malcolm Gladwell, and I don't know if he came up with the term, but he talks about high leverage giving. And if you had a $1 million check, you're a wealthy philanthropist. You could write $1 million check to your alma mater, and maybe they'll build a building or half. These days, you can't build many buildings for that much. Or you give $1 million to an impoverished country, and you could send thousands of people to college, right? So it just goes directly to immediate impact, and it has much higher leverage.
Yeah, but I think, Bill, it's important to give to a cause or an organization whose work really resonates with you, right? So I think it's more important to ask yourself as a philanthropist, what's important to me? What are the kinds of issues that I want to support because they have a meaningful personal resonance for me? I think that's the question also that philanthropists should be asking themselves. And so I think that's equally, it's as important, I think.
Right. And Chris Anderson of TED the TED organization has a new book called Infectious Generosity. And one of the things he talks about in there is we should really get over our sort of shaming of philanthropy when people say, okay, that's nice they gave that money, but they should have given it over here. Or it's nice they wrote that check, but boy, it's about time. Or they could have done so much more. It's just like, let's just take it for what it is and raise that up and make it a little more infectious and not criticize people when they're trying to do the right thing.
I agree. I mean, sort of modeling is very important too. I mean, look at Mackenzie Scott and sort of her approach to philanthropy. I think it's changing the way people are thinking about how you might, there aren't that many uber wealthy people, but how you might approach philanthropy differently. I think what's interesting about her approach is that she's not necessarily asking the organizations that she supports to heavy loads of accountability and what they're going to spend it on. There's this sort of trust-based philanthropy that I think is a growing movement, and that she's sort of leading, which is, pick people, pick organizations, and trust them to do the work that they want to do. And so that's very refreshing as a CEO of a nonprofit, because we spend a lot of time reporting and being accountable to our donors. And sometimes that takes away from the work that we could be doing, right?
And sometimes I've talked to other people in similar shoes as yours who say, also they'll obsess about percentage of expense that's in overhead and people. And they say, okay, I get that, but I need some people to administer these services, or I need some people to frankly respond to all your requests. Or it's a lot of work that a lot of requests that just don't make sense. And they're so pleased with the way Mackenzie Scott's approaching it, like you said, of just, hey, we trust your organization. Here's a check. Go get them.
Yeah. And I mean, in the for-profit sector, people understand that you need to invest in order to grow. Right? But we have a different sort of standard for nonprofits. It's the same way. You need to invest in people. You need to invest in technology in order to create more impact. But for some reason, that is it's not seen as acceptable. Yeah.
So let's talk about impact, and let's dig in a little more to Trickle Up. So what are you all about? Describe to me and our audience sort of what you all do, what kind of impact you've had and are trying to have. Just give us a sense for what Trickle Up does.
Sure, thank you. Well, Trickle Up's mission is to partner with women living in extreme poverty to build economic opportunity and drive inclusion. So what that means is that we work with women in very low resource settings, women who are living on less than $2.15 a day, and really help them create micro enterprises and livelihoods that enable them to feed their family, send their kids to school, and create some economic resilience so that when they are faced with some kind of challenge, they don't necessarily fall back into extreme poverty, that they have a cushion that they can sort of build for the future. So Trickle Up's work is based on the graduation approach. It's a very well-studied and evaluated approach. It's time-bound. It's about 2 to 3 years. It's sequenced in terms of its activities. And it really is designed to help people forge these resilient pathways out of poverty, these resilient and sustainable pathways out of poverty by creating livelihoods and micro enterprises. And it's been proven to be effective, across the world in a variety of contexts, and predominantly in rural sort of last mile communities. That's where it's had a lot of success. But in terms of the program itself, there's sort of about 4 key components. The first one is the creation of savings groups. So these are groups of about 20 to 25 women that come together on a very regular basis to start saving money. And so it creates the first step in financial inclusion. And it's also the sort of mechanism through which training and support is delivered to this team of women. But the savings creates this financial resilience that I was talking about. One of the things I'm fascinated about the savings groups, their objective is to create financial resilience. But what ends up happening is that it creates a lot of psychosocial support for the participants in that group. And so they're always supporting each other and mentoring each other and creating sort of this circle of support. And so that was not their intention, but that is one of their fascinating impacts. The other three areas really quickly of support or the components of our work is that we provide seed capital. So this is sort of the sort of like microfinance, but it's not a loan, right? It's actually a grant. These people are too poor to be able to be funding back or reimbursing a loan. Right. So this is just a pure grant.
Yes.
And that helps them start their micro enterprise, buy some productive assets, or buy working or use it as working capital for their small business. So that's a very important component. And there's been a lot of talk, Bill, about cash and cash plus. And this cash, this is unrestricted cash, is really intended for them to start a business, to start a livelihood. Two other really important components. One is a lot of training, technical training, financial literacy training, digital training. Those are the components, sort of hard skills that are needed to become a successful entrepreneur, a successful micro-entrepreneur. And then underpinning everything that we do is coaching. And, it's hard to be an entrepreneur in any context. Yes. It's even harder to be a woman entrepreneur in what can sometimes be a pretty male-dominated kind of environment, and sort of to break through social stigma and become a successful entrepreneur. So the coaching is there to help you every step of the way. And so you have a coach, it's a group coaching, there's individual coaching, but what it does is that really supports that entrepreneur's journey through the program as she builds her livelihood, as she establishes herself as a micro-entrepreneur. And it's so fun, Bill, to see these women who at the very first meeting really don't know why they should save and really don't speak up. At the end of 2 years, they're running a business.
Amazing.
And they're providing for their family. And there's this really phenomenal personal transformation in terms of what they think is possible for themselves.
Right.
And for their future. So that's just so joyful to see that. It really is what motivates me every day.
It seems like a model too, where it's sort of you're not giving someone a fish, you're teaching them how to fish, right? And so that eventually, if your work goes well, you can move on. You've planted seeds that are going to grow, and you don't. It's not this constant sort of just dropping money on top of people, but it's actually training them to be self-sustaining, and then you can broaden your impact. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Oh, that's totally right. Yeah. And my board chair and I co-wrote exactly that. It's an article called Teaching Women to Fish.
Oh, come on. I did not know that, but that, good.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but here's the other thing that I think is important to note. Yes, the program, creates or enables women to create these micro enterprises and livelihoods. That's a solution. But actually, when you change your perception of yourself and what's possible, your first business might not work, but you build this kind of perception of what's possible for yourself. So we've seen examples time and time again where the first business may not work for a variety of reasons, but a lot of these entrepreneurs have built the really self-confidence that they can do something. And so they try something else and then they succeed. So I think that is a solution in of itself, right?
A quick break now before we get back to my blue sky conversation with Nathalie Laidler-Kylander, so I can tell you about another podcast we think our listeners will enjoy. Well Adjusting on the Edit Audio Network is a show hosted by award-winning actor, comedian, and author Robin Hopkins. Join Robin as she speaks to real people about the real questions that many of us face, from how to find work-life balance to dealing with generational money trauma or grief, or even finding common ground with family across the political divide. Well Adjusting isn't afraid to get personal or honest about the tough stuff in life. Think less therapist couch and NPR and more chatting through a problem with a friend over cocktails. Whether you're looking for advice on how to manage stress, set some boundaries, or just a reminder that we're all figuring it out one day at a time, Well Adjusting is for you. Follow Well Adjusting on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now, back to our episode of Blue Sky. Nathalie uses Mackenzie Scott's example to describe a concept I really like. She calls it trust-based philanthropy. From all I've heard and learned from nonprofit leaders, this approach could do so much to make their work more efficient, less burdened by reporting requirements, so better able to focus on the important work at hand. And I did a messy job of metaphor mixing there with the teaching to fish and planting seeds bit, but I was pleased to know that Nathalie at least latched on to the fishing part. And this is so important to her work, this idea that by empowering women with grants, not loans, and coaching them to be successful, this will happen even after Trickle Up moves on to the next people they serve. Getting back to our conversation, I asked Nathalie to tell us where in the world Trickle Up does this important and high-impact work.
We work across 3 continents, but we're predominantly focused in India, East Africa, Uganda, and Kenya. And in Latin America, we're in Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia.
And to do the kind of coaching and mentoring and setting up these savings groups, I assume you have people in country, or how are you staffed? How does that all work? 'Cause that's a pretty big geographical spread that you're covering.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we have teams in country. And so all of our programs are implemented by our local staff and run by local leadership. And that leadership is really part of the organizational leadership. I think what's important to note also is that we always work through partners.
Okay.
So we work through local community partners, we work through local government partners, we work through INGOs, large international organizations. And so we also are trying to build the capacity of others to do this work.
Yes.
Because if and when we have to leave or move on to another project, we're leaving behind capacity in existing organizations to continue to do this kind of work. So in India, for example, some of our very local partners have gone on to continue to do graduation-like programming with other resources and for other communities. So I think it's really in our DNA to always be building the capacity of other organizations to adopt and adapt the kind of work that we know works, right, through 40 years of experience. So that's a really important component, I think, of our strategy.
And you mentioned women with whom you work gaining a confidence in business and in their acumen and saving and that sort of thing. I imagine you run into all kinds of cultural barriers in certain countries. Are you finding, too, that with that confidence and with that ability to do their own business, you're actually able to make some social change or progress with women?
Love that question. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and in several ways. So the first sort of most direct way is that economic empowerment sort of leads to social empowerment, and that can lead to political empowerment. And what I mean by that is we have numerous examples of women in our programs who've gone on to run for public office at the village level, for sure, yes, but have really engaged in their community and have gone on to run in India. It's called the Panchayat, which is the local community government. So there's that connection between economic empowerment, social empowerment, and political empowerment. But there's another thing at work, which is when you go, and I hope you'll come one day, yes, Bill, to visit one of our programs, but when you sit and observe the savings groups, these women are running their own savings groups. We don't. There's a president, there's a secretary, there's a treasurer. Yep. They are running the savings group. They run it like an efficient bank. You know, recently I was in Mexico, and they have a rule that if you're late, you have to pay for every minute that you're late to the meeting.
I like that.
These women are tough. They're like, okay, this is the way we're going to run it. And they're running it themselves. But what's fascinating to me is around this group of women who are running their own meeting, saving money, supporting each other in their commercial enterprises, coaching each other. You have a group of children, young women, young men who are listening in. So what are they seeing? They're seeing all of the things I just said. Women running their businesses, women running this bank, women holding each other accountable. And so for that group of children and young adults, what's normal is going to be different than what was normal for their parents, right? Yeah. And so I think there is an impact there, a social sort of shifting of gender norms in particular, that makes me very hopeful and optimistic. Fascinating.
You may have answered this question when I asked you about your attraction to nonprofits, but I wonder if, and I've experienced this sometimes where, you and I went to this prestigious business school and we have classmates who are billionaires and have their name in headlines, sometimes for the wrong reasons. But are there times when you think, okay, this is, like you said, this is so hard? And, you don't have stock options and are there times when you think, gosh, I wonder what it would have been like if I did something else, or is this is it for you?
No, it's such an interesting and juicy question, Bill, right? I mean, so here's what I think. I think it depends on your definition of success, right? So if your definition of success, which is actually kind of society's definition of success, money, power, privilege, fame. So under that scenario, I'd say I'm not successful, right? And maybe I should question what I'm doing. But if your definition of success is something like happiness, then that's kind of different, right? And I think there's a lot of research, many studies really, that show that after you reach a particular sort of income level, increasing wealth does not necessarily result in increased happiness, right?
Right, exactly.
But what we do know about what increases happiness is doing work that's meaningful, helping others, and developing and maintaining strong personal relationships. Those are actually much better indicators of happiness. And, if your definition of success is happiness, then, I think I'm doing pretty well. But so, listen, Bill, I have a great solution for increasing the happiness of our economically successful classmates. They can use their great wealth to donate to Trickle Up or another nonprofit or a cause that resonates with them. And that can do two things. It can bring meaning to their lives. Yeah. It can create an opportunity to help others. That's like an instant endorphin hit, right? It's like guaranteed endorphin hit. So that would be what I would say to our very successful classmates. And to be honest, a lot of them do support Trickle Up, and a lot of them are very generous philanthropists too.
Yeah, my listeners know, and I think I used to work with Ted Turner and worked with him on his autobiography. And he was one of the first big check writer philanthropists. He gave $1 billion pledge to start the United Nations Foundation. And he said, it's the most fun I ever had. And he said, I was very disillusioned when I became this wealthy because I assumed that all my peers at that level also gave tons of money away. And he said, I was just shocked by how many of them were just kind of keeping score and not doing it. And he said, I've never had more fun than when I've been philanthropic. Yeah.
And I think that's mirrored by a lot of people. I think that's the experience of a lot of people, including members of our board, who have had incredible careers in the finance sector. Our board chair, Penny Foley, just stepped down after 14 years. And she said the role that she's played on the board of Trickle Up has been the most meaningful thing she's done in her life. Even though she's like this celebrated success, in the financial sector, she's an absolute phenom. But for her, the most meaningful part of her career has been the work at Trickle Up, which I just find fabulous.
Once again, Nathalie describes ways that Trickle Up efficiently tackles its ambitious mission. Instead of trying to do it all themselves, they find local partners and leverage their capabilities. And you can hear how inspired she is by this idea of economic empowerment of women leading to social empowerment and ultimately political empowerment. And at long last, after 50 plus episodes, I finally asked a question that was deemed to be interesting and juicy, leading Nathalie to give a very thoughtful response about the importance of understanding your own personal definition of success. You can hear the teacher in Nathalie when she discusses this topic. And to kick off our final segment, I asked her about other career advice that she might offer. If you were giving advice to young people, or maybe a mid-career person, in a for-profit setting or law firm, whatever, who wants to make a change and wants to have the kind of impact that you've been able to have in your career that Trickle Up has, what advice do you give? Is it starting your own thing? Is it joining something existing? What kind of advice would you give?
So first I would say, please don't start another nonprofit.
There are plenty, aren't there?
There are a lot out there. Join an existing nonprofit. Help that be successful. But, for me, this question kind of goes back to your question about success and comparison to our classmates. I think the first, I would be well suited to follow my own advice, but I would say the first thing I would recommend doing is having your own definition of success, right?
Yes.
And so maybe that means answering the question, what do you want to accomplish? How do you want to live? What's your North Star? It's too easy, I think, for all of us, but particularly people starting their careers, right, to just sort of buy into societal definitions of success. And I'm not sure that leads to happiness. I think it's really worth taking the time to say, what's important to me? What's meaningful for me? What do I want to do? So that would be one recommendation. And then I think the second thing I would say is don't worry too much about climbing any kind of ladder, Yes. Tap into and listen to what energizes you, what brings you joy. It's one thing to manage your time and your career. It's another to manage your energy and do things, not necessarily particular careers, but activities that really get you into a state of flow. So be open to listening to that. It's kind of trite to say, do what you love, but it's kind of true. If you enjoy what you do, you're going to be successful. And so that'd be one thing. The final thing I would say is, there's a couple of insights that I've been thinking. A couple of things I've been thinking about. One, we are human beings, not human doings. And what I mean by that is don't think just about what you do, but how you do it. And I would say be mindful. Be mindful of how you interact with others and be mindful about how you treat yourself as well.
Yes.
And really try to tap into empathy. There's that great Maya Angelou quote. I think it's something like, people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And so I think it's really important to be mindful about how we treat ourselves and others. So it's not just about what you do, but it's how you do it. I think that is important.
Fantastic advice. That was
Be good
truly.
If I took it myself.
Yes, no, we all strive for a lot of what you describe. We don't always meet those goals. A question I meant to ask earlier, I'll ask it now. So you took on this role at Trickle Up during an interesting time. When we hear 2021, one of the things we might think of is the pandemic. And I enjoy, as difficult as that period was, and hopefully we're coming out the other end, what was that like for you to manage an organization like yours during the pandemic? And were there any silver linings or learnings or things that you've taken on the other side that were making it a stronger organization than it was before?
Absolutely. I mean, this is sort of the Optimism podcast. There's always a silver lining, right, Phil?
There you go.
But I think for nonprofits as a whole, the pandemic accelerated their adoption and use of technology. So what I mean by that is that organizations that were doing things in a certain way really had to accelerate and think differently about how they deliver services and products. And that really strengthened them. It really sort of changed their DNA and strengthened them. So I think there was that silver lining for the sector as a whole. The second thing is that it really proved that you can be effective if you're not all sitting in the same office every day.
Yes.
And so that, I think, has opened up a lot of possibilities for all organizations, but for Trickle Up in particular, it's really enabled us to think differently about our own organization. You know, we're spread out across the world. We're in India, we're in Latin America, we're in East Africa, we're in the US. And in a way, it gave us the opportunity to say, okay, the hybrid thing is hard, and to be clear, we're still trying to figure it out. But it does enable a different way of thinking about how you work as a team and how you engage as a team. I think it was hard to start as a new CEO in an organization during the pandemic. I was so diligent. I live in Boston, but we work in a lot of our team is based around New York, and I was so diligent the first year, always coming into the office. Yes. But I'd often find myself the only person in the office, and so that was kind of interesting too. And it means that you have to be a lot more intentional, I think, about building a relationship with colleagues without that, face-to-face interaction. I have a lot of colleagues that do something which I really admire. Is they just pick up the phone and call me. Yes. It's the alternative to putting your head around the door and saying, "Hey, do you have 5 minutes?"
Yes.
And so I would really encourage people to do that. I mean, maybe not everybody likes that, but for me, that's been sort of the alternative to the water cooler or the popping the head through the office to ask a question. And I find that's worked well too.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I wanted to ask you this question, like you said before, I would think this sort of the efficient scaling opportunities. So if you're going to mentor someone starting a business on the other side of the globe, you can have someone in country that's definitely preferable, but you could also have someone, match the time zones or, get up early in the morning and do it virtually. And I mean, the savings and the ability. So there are people in India looking at diagnostic slides from America, to help with healthcare systems here. And we could do the same going the other way. It seems to me it all of a sudden just changes your horizon in a big way in terms of the breadth of your impact.
Not only that, it changes who's on the team and how they work together. So that's really cool.
Right.
I think, one of the things I'm very excited about is a coaching app that we're developing here at Trickle Up. And exactly to your point, using technology, using digital technology to increase our scale and lower our costs. And so I think that's also part of this, part of the silver lining, if you will, of the pandemic is like alternative mechanisms for delivering services like coaching. I would stress, I think it's really important in coaching to have one in face-to-face interactions, but you can supplement it, right? With some more sort of technology, I'd say.
Okay. So as we wrap up this fantastic conversation, you've been at this being nonprofit work around the world, global development. And when you started out, I'm sure you had ideas about what you might be able to accomplish and the state of the world and that sort of thing. As you've come through this far, 30 plus years, are you more or less the same optimistic about our ability to move the needle, to make change, to make the world a better place? Where are you versus where you started out?
Oh, well, no question. We have a lot of challenges, but I am definitely more optimistic. And the reason, Bill, is that we have solutions to our problems. Yes. We may lack political will. That I think is probably true, but we actually have the technical and financial capability to solve extreme poverty, to slow down climate change. I mean, we do know what those solutions are. We know they work. And we do, as a society, global society, have the financial capability to make those changes. So I'm more optimistic. You know, as humans, we're very resourceful, we're very adaptable, we're resilient. I have to tell you, I see that every day in the women that we have this incredible privilege to work with. I got to tell you, if they can change their future at a micro level, there's no reason that we can't, we as the collective whole, can't change ours at a macro level.
And with all the division that we obsess about and is fed to us in social media and traditional media, a lot of the research I read suggests that as a species, we're incredibly cooperative. We that is more our default than being combative. And we just need to embrace that and celebrate that and raise that up more than we do now. Is that something you would agree with?
Totally resonates with me. And I think, Bill, the work that you do creates a lot of hope and optimism. People need
Thank you.
Hope and optimism. And I think that helps people feel more connected to the world, more connected to each other. That creates, you know, you can't love what you don't know. And so I think what you're doing is sort of creating connections for them. I think that's going to make them more generous and happier.
Well, I can't top that, Nathalie. So I think we should end there. It has been an absolute delight to talk to you. I have a sense for how busy you are and all the different ways you're pulled in different directions. And I really appreciate you setting aside this time. You've been a terrific guest, and I can't thank you enough.
It's been so much fun, and I'm such a big admirer of what you do. And it's been a privilege and a pleasure. Thanks so much, Bill.
Thanks, Nathalie. That was more terrific guidance from Nathalie when she suggested we worry less about climbing the corporate ladder and remind ourselves that we are human beings, not human doings. As other Blue Sky alums, particularly Anita Novak, have suggested, Nathalie says it's important to develop a sense of empathy as we approach the work we want to do and the difference we hope to make. And as I've pointed out many times, a common trait of optimists is to look for solutions when presented with a challenge. Imagine being Nathalie and taking over an international nonprofit in 2021. She'd commute from Boston to New York to find herself as the only person in the office. But quickly, she and the Trickle Up team developed ways to stay productive, and today find themselves continuing practices learned during the pandemic that allow them to be even more efficient than they were before the days of COVID-19. And of course, I loved hearing Nathalie describe the roots of her optimism. We have the solution, she says, to so many of the world's most vexing problems. We just need to have the will to put them in place. And I appreciated her kind words for the work we're doing at the Optimism Institute. We really enjoy helping you come to know more about our inspiring guests and the work they do. She says, you can't love what you don't know. And it's our hope that through these conversations, we'll give you more to love and be optimistic about the great and good things being done in our world. I hope you enjoyed this Blue Sky conversation with Nathalie Laidler-Kylander of Trickle Up. We'd love it if you gave us a rating or review before you go. And if you like this sort of content, be sure to follow the Optimism Institute on social media and subscribe to Blue Sky on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. We're also offering a monthly newsletter, Blue Sky Weekend, so sign up for that on the Optimism Institute website. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.